Well, okay, it is 2:30, so let's call this meeting of the Harris Ranch Community Infrastructure District Number 1 to order. Clerk, would you take the roll?
Agent.
Here.
Clegg.
Here.
Woodings. 2 present, 1 absent.
Councilmember Woodings, I believe, will be attending remotely, so when she gets here, we'll note that in the record. The first item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from July 19th, 2022. I was not present at that meeting, so I will not be voting, but do we have a motion?
Mr. Chair, I move that we approve the Harris Ranch Community Infrastructure District Number 1 minutes of the regular meeting of July 19th, 2022.
I have reviewed the minutes, so I will second the motion. Clerk, will you call the roll?
Agent.
I'll abstain from the vote.
Clegg.
Yes. We don't have Holly yet. Do we have to wait for her to?
We can postpone the minutes.
Okay.
So
Till she gets
Let's do
here.
that. So we'll move item 2 on the agenda to after item 3. It'll be the new item 3. Next up on the agenda are our agenda items. Oh, there's Councilmember Woodings, who's present. And I believe staff has a presentation on the action items from the last meeting.
Yes, Mr. Chair. So good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. It's good to see all of you again. In our last meeting, the board approved, oh, that was not what I was expecting. There we go. In our last meeting, the board approved the fiscal 2023 budget with the change that the bond levy was to be reduced by 10%. The board added the request that staff bring forward the numbers that would show the impact of that change both to the district as well as to the taxpayers. The purpose of today's meeting is to present those updated numbers and reaffirm or review the resolution. So we'll start with looking at the impact of the general obligation bond, the bonding impact. Then we'll discuss the impact to the residents' property taxes bill. And then lastly, I'll show the budget itself. So the primary impact to the district is to the size of the general obligation bond that could be issued, and therefore the size of the projects that could be purchased from the developer. And so you can see on chart A on the left of this slide, it shows the relative size of the bond that could be issued based on the different mill rates. So the first scenario is $8 million at the full mill rate of 2.85 mils. And then the third, that 90% levy, is what the board had approved in the July 19th meeting, which is about $5.6 million. And the size of those bonds is based on interest rates from last week. That is why the sizes show up a little different from the July 19th meeting. Before I move on to chart B, any questions about the size there?
I guess one question for you, David. That size would continue to potentially fluctuate with interest rates going into next year, this winter, this spring.
That's Mr. Chair, that's correct.
Okay.
Mr. Chair. David, just to clarify, you're showing here 5.6 million, but I think later I've seen the end of this presentation. You're talking a little bit more than that. Am I reading that wrong?
So, Mr. Chair, Board Member Clegg, the budget itself makes a slight allowance for the fluctuations. And so we'd typically round it up to nearest whole million. And so you will see in the revenue side that there is 6 million listed in revenue, okay. But according to current rates, it's about 5.6 million. It could go up or down from there, depending on rates on the day that the bond is, the rate is locked in.
If I could. So what you're proposing, if we go that route, is that we could bond up to that depending on what the interest rates allow.
Yes, and so in fact, we also have a contingency appropriation of 1.8 million. Typically, the district will issue 15-year bonds, there is a chance, and in 2020, we did issue a 20-year bond. So the budget makes allowances for both changes in interest rates as well as the possibility, although remote, that we could get a 20-year bond.
Thank you.
All right, continuing onward, the chart B shows the impact of an incremental taxing district. And so in gray, you can see the amount of the levy that is used to support existing debt service. And then in the case of the full levy, a 90% bond or a 90% levy, you can see that the yellow area on the top represents the incremental revenue that is used to fund a bond. So 0.7 million in incremental revenue is able to fund an $8 million bond. On the far right, a $0.5 million in incremental revenue would be able to fund about 5.6 million. So it's important to note that although the levy itself was reduced by 10%, because of the change to the incremental revenue, the size of the bond itself gets reduced by 30%. So that's an important distinction for the board to see and consider as part of the budget. So let me pause there, because for the bond size, that's a key point. Okay. Moving on to the impact to the residents. The primary impact to residents between the full levy and then the 90% bond, which I suggested I put in there as an example just to show a middle road in between the two options. Each different scenario changes the amount of property tax from the bond levy by about $100. And what I did here is I'm showing two different ways of looking at the impact to residents. On the left in chart C, I chose a home within the district that is $835,000 in estimated value according to Zillow. And on the right is just an estimate based on the Ada County assessors. I'm sorry, I've mixed that up. The first side is the Ada County assessors. The right side, D, is Zillow and their estimates. And so what you can see is that in the case of a representative home in 2021, there is a big jump between 2021 and 2020 and the actual value of that home. And so even though for the average, when you look at it mathematically, there's not a significant change, for many residents, they are going to see increases of between 27% in the case of the 90% levy and a 41% increase in the case of a full levy to the amount of their property taxes that they pay to the district specific for the bond levy. So let me pause there and see if there's any questions.
Mr. Chairman. David, so as I'm looking at this, what you're saying is that absent the new construction in the district, the typical home would have only increased 150,000 in value in 2021, and this year will increase another 235,000 in value. Isn't that the difference between the bigger increase between 20 and 21 versus 21 and 22 on the right versus the left?
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, Board Member Clegg, in the case of the chart C, what is happening is that there is it entirely shows a change due to the actual change in assessed value per the Ada County assessor. So that 2021 value of 602,000 going up to 835,000, that's just entirely due for this one home due to the change in assessed value. In chart D, the reason why the increase is about 11% increase, why it's a relatively small increase, is that the average value of the homes in the district has been kept down by the large proportionally larger construction of townhomes and condos within the district. So I'm not sure if I exactly answered your question, but I'll pause there and see.
It does a little, if I could follow up. I guess my bigger question, we have the one representative home. How representative is that? I mean, was work done on that home? Was there a reason for the particular jump on that home versus maybe a more trend jump between the 2 years?
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, Board Member Clegg, that's a great question. And I've looked at probably a handful, so about 5 or 6 different homes within the district. And what I did look for was to make sure that it wasn't new construction. So it would be a home that had been around since around 2015 or so. And so I did find that in many cases, those were typical of homes within the district, that they do have a large jump in property
in
value.
22. Okay.
But I, readily admit that that is a extremely small sample set on which to be drawing from.
Thank you.
All right. So I think, what's important to take away here is that between each of the 3 different options that I had in the previous slides, either the full levy, reducing the bond by 10%, or reducing the levy by 10%, each one of those step downs has an impact to the average home in the district, regardless of the lens that you use, of about $100 reduction in each case.
David, if I can ask one quick question, this may not be fair. Do you happen to know the distribution of home values in the district? For example, what is the 95th percentile and what is the 5th percentile? I'm just trying to get a sense of if, what average is average, and it's a very useful number, but whether there's a large clump at the bottom offset by, 2 or 3 Bill Gates style homes at the top, just like how the value is actually distributed. Do you know?
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, that's a fantastic question. And the Zillow data doesn't have this, in particular, the standard distribution to be able to see that. I think that in the future, that would be a great question to ask of Ada County to get some of that data that shows the statistical distribution and whether it's a normal distribution, whether it's a barbell distribution or a skewed. So I think that's an excellent question for future analysis.
Thank you.
All right. In these last set of slides, I'm presenting the actual budget. So this is the budget as was proposed by the board or directed by the board in the July 19th meeting. And so I'm going to move on just so you can see some of the revenue and expense highlights. So I'm actually comparing all 3 of them together. And so you can see the bond levy decreasing, that 10% decrease. And then you can see the changes to the bond revenue. Again, because those are rounded off, you can use the numbers I proposed earlier. This is just simply what shows up in the budget if the board does decide to approve the budget, and then the total revenue. Any questions before I jump to expenses? Okay. Then here are the key things. Most of the budget itself and the expenses side does not change, but you can see the changes to debt service and then the amount that would be used for community infrastructure. And again, those community infrastructure numbers will change based on the actual size of the bond, which is in turn based on the interest rates when the bond interest rate is locked in.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah, go ahead, Councilmember Woodings.
David, how does that community infrastructure number compare to prior years? Do you know that information off the top of your head?
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, Board Member Woodings, that's an excellent question. For last year, based on where interest rates were, the board had given approval for about a $5 million bond. And with where interest rates are right now, it's in between 4.5 and 5 million that could be issued for that fiscal year 2022 budget.
Great, thank you.
I guess one more quick question while we're in that sort of that vein. You can tell me if this is right or if I have it wrong. My understanding is that the developer accrues interest on unreimbursed projects at a certain rate. I know that it's higher than our bond, I think. That's my understanding, and that the bond rates are lower. And so can you walk me through what the interest burden is under a lower bond authority with potentially unreimbursed projects versus a higher bond authority with reimbursed projects? And what I'm trying to get to the extent you can, is what is or is not better for the mission of the CID, which is to accelerate infrastructure development.
Yeah, and so one quick second.
If I've jumped ahead and you're getting there, I apologize.
No, this is I just need to pull this number. So based on where we were in the July meeting, I looked at the growth rate of the district and then just said, let's just assume that we go with the 90% levy for just this 1 year. And over the course of the life of the district, it would make about a $370,000 difference. So that is to say, the district has $50 million of bond authorization that it could use if the district were to elect to choose the scenario that 90% levy, or reducing the full levy by 10%, an additional $370,000 of the bond authorization would be used for interest to be paid to the developer, as opposed to being used for community infrastructure projects.
And that's because of the spread between the bond interest and the accrued interest to the developer for unreimbursed projects.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, since we're here, I have a follow-up question about that. Did you also do the math on a 90% bond rather than a 90% levy?
Unfortunately, I did not do on the 90% bond.
Okay. So then my second question, which was the other one I was going to ask, it looks like we're 500,000 less in what we had hoped to bond last year. If we go at a 90% levy, we're going to be at another 2.5 million, so 3 million total that will not be bonded if we go with this. What projects get left unreimbursed in that scenario that are already on the approved list?
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, Board Member Clegg, I don't have the exact projects in front of me, but I can say that for the typical size that the developer has been submitting projects, many of the projects are in about that range. So it would mean that easily a whole project would be unreimbursed. And in some cases, more than one.
And if we went with a 90% bond, it's only about 500,000 added to last year's 500,000, it'd be $1 million less overall that we'd be able to bond. Okay.
That's correct. And that actually concludes my presentation. So I will stand for any additional questions.
David, I have one from my notes on the last meeting that you had without me. And the question really is, what happens to the remaining bonding authority in the CID in future years if for some reason the value of the assets in the district falls significantly? And it's not like a navel gazing question, like really what happens under each of these scenarios? And so that'll help us understand whether that factor should weigh into our decision.
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, that's an excellent question. The way that the district works is a little different from city property taxes in that there is no foregone that is given up. However, instead, what happens is the district does a test to see if there is additional bond revenue available if it were to levy at 2.85 mils. And so if there is, then the district can issue based on that incremental revenue. In that slide previous, you can see that that incremental revenue in yellow is what's used to pay for an additional bond. The 1.4 million represents the debt service that the district is currently committed to. There is a possibility that if we have an economic downturn, that there is no incremental revenue. So it would mean that until the value of the district returned to levels above where it is today, there would be no ability to bond in that year that the value of the district declined.
And am I correct that either reducing the mill rate or reducing the available bonding authority, I guess by 10% makes that scenario, I don't know what, 10% more likely? It potentially exacerbates that problem, depending on how far property values fall.
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, it would ultimately delay the ability to bond in the future and therefore increase the amount of interest accrual that would accumulate at that higher rate.
Understood. Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, I think that's a fair point. In the scenario that I had shown, that 370,000, I had assumed that we would be able to bond for that in a following year. And so that would, in the scenario that you had suggested, that would not be the case.
Understood.
David, I have one more question. If you could go back to the slide that showed the typical home and the Zillow. Yeah, that one. So the representative home, at least in this slide, actually fell in value in 2020. What's up with that? My home sure didn't.
So, Mr. Chair, Board Member Clegg, and that surprised me as well. And I did look at a few other homes and did see that that was the case. And some of that had to do with decisions by the Ada County assessor. They have a band that they can assess at between 90 to 110%. And so I can't comment on their decision-making process, but for many homes throughout the city, while it didn't fall, it didn't rise a real lot. And in a few cases within Harris Ranch, it actually did fall.
And so explain to me what happens to the debt service of previously issued bonds when that happens in the district, given that it's a set levy and not a floating budget.
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, Board Member Clegg, that's a great question. In this particular case within 2020, what happened was, although there were some cases where the assessed value may have fallen, overall new construction within the district and possibly appreciation of other homes, especially on the higher end, did make up for that. And so the district was able to bond in that particular case. Additionally, in 2020, if you recall, I mentioned we received an offer for a 20-year bond. And so between all of those, it allowed for a fairly significant bond issuance in that year compared to previous years for the district.
Thank you, because I thought that was what I was remembering, and it just didn't make sense to me with this number. Okay, that's helpful.
Board Member Woodings, any other follow-up?
Nope, thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. So what we have before us is a resolution. What is the pleasure of the board?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
when I accepted the motion of the Councilmember Woodings or Board Member Woodings last meeting, I did not fully appreciate the impact on the bonding authority that a 10% levy adjustment would have. It's really helpful to understand the incremental growth versus the existing bonding authority, and why a 10% decrease in levy amount would have such a 30% impact on the bonding authority. I have been concerned for a while that the interest costs of delaying payment of the reimbursed costs ultimately will reduce the amount of infrastructure that the district can build and that the district can repurchase from the developer, which ultimately will mean that some of the things that folks in the district were promised won't be able to be built. And I empathize with tax increases, certainly. I think all of us do. We've all experienced them. But given that, it seems to me that the middle scenario actually comes closer to what I expected the impact of the motion that we made last time would have on the overall budget. And don't know if my calculations are right, but if they would save the taxpayers of the district about $250,000 in interest by going with that 90% bond versus the 90% levy.
Is there a motion in there?
So I guess the question is what the motion would be. And I'm looking here. I would move that we approve HR CID 9-2022, a resolution approving the fiscal year 2023 operating budget for the Harris Ranch Community Infrastructure District Number 1, with the following amendment: that the total budget amount be adjusted to reflect a 90% bond of the allowed amount with the adjusted impact on the levy as follows: a 90% bond at 2.76 mil for a total budget amount of $20,590,385,000.
Okay, we have a motion. Do we have a second? It would appear that that motion dies for lack of a second.
Mr. Chairman,
Board Member Whittings.
I would like to move. I'm sorry, I'm only working off of my laptop right now, so I keep going back and forth in between screens. I would like to move that we approve HRCID 9-2022, a resolution approving the fiscal year 2023 operating budget for the Harris Ranch Community Infrastructure District Number 1 and providing an effective date.
As I understand it, just so that I'm clear, Board Member Whittings, this would be the proposed budget prior to any amendments from the last meeting?
I believe that it is with the 90% levy rate, if I'm not mistaken,
Understood. We have a
as
motion.
we directed in the prior meeting.
Understood. We have a motion. Is there a second? It would appear that the motion dies for lack of a second. My colleagues have both tried, so the chair will make a motion and we'll see how it goes. I would move approval of the fiscal year 2023 operating budget for the Harris Ranch Community Infrastructure District Number 1 as proposed by staff prior to the last meeting. In other words, at 100% and without 90% mill rates or 90% bonding authority.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Let me explain my reasoning. Because this is hard. and this board in particular, given our composition, is in a bit of a push-pull situation. On the one hand, we have a duty to the mission of the infrastructure district, which is to accelerate as much as possible the development of infrastructure in the district through this bonding authority. On the other hand, we're all elected members of the Boise City Council. We have a duty both through this entity and to the public at large to do well by our city and its people. And I certainly continue to believe that property taxes, in light of the incredible explosion of value here, are not doing well by our people. If you look at wages in the Treasure Valley and you compare that to the tax burden for homeowners, if you look at really any metric, it's not sustainable. As we all know, because we howl from the dais about this all the time, that's a function of state law. There's very little that we can do at a city level to address that fundamental inequity. The things that we can do, and I draw a lot of analogy to our annual budget in this regard, are to play around the edges and try to provide a little bit of relief. So, for example, in our city budget this year, we talked about whether and to what extent to take the 3% budget increase that we're allowed to. And what we saw in the budget presentations is the same thing we see every year. Not taking the 3% reduces the average homeowner's tax bill by a very small amount, even though the tax bill actually goes up by a great amount because of the rise in equity. And that's the same structural problem we have here. We can reduce the mill rate a little or reduce the bonding authority a little. It will affect the average homeowner's tax bill for the infrastructure district by about $100. It will, however, also have this downstream tail effect of reducing the bonding authority of the district, which is antithetical to the mission of the district's purpose to accelerate infrastructure development. And maybe more importantly, it will reduce the ability of the district to fund infrastructure projects by shifting, according to one estimate today, for example, over $300,000 of money for projects into debt service for unreimbursed projects on the developer side. So what do you do with that? Well, we have a duty to the district. We have a duty to the taxpayer. And I think you have to weigh the pros and cons. And for me, the pro of reducing a tax bill by $100, even though that tax bill is going to go up by hundreds and hundreds of dollars, so slightly lessening the amount it's increasing at the expense of potentially an entire project in the district, suggests that the balance should be in favor of continuing to maximize the bonding authority. The other tipping points for me on that were, although interest rates are rising, they're still below the developer's reimbursement rate. And although there is a possibility, there's certainly economic uncertainty now, and there's a possibility of economic problems in the future, all of those cut both ways. And what we know right now is that we can borrow money to complete infrastructure projects for less than we would pay the debt to reimburse the developer for unreimbursed projects. And so for those reasons, I made the motion for approval of the budget in full form and without the reductions that my colleagues discussed in the last meeting.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I won't be supporting the motion, and it's for many of the reasons that I verbalized in our last meeting. I think that we're at a point with the CID where property values have increased at a level that was not anticipated. The impact of that on homeowners is outsized from, I think, what was anticipated. And I think that by lowering that, that levy amount, it provides a little bit of relief where there's always a balance to be stricken as well, as my colleagues have pointed out, on what the bonding authority is, how that accelerates the build out of infrastructure, and how that potentially impacts the infrastructure that ultimately gets built and reimbursed. So I was really trying to strike a balance with that. This is a way that the CID has that the city does not have to impact property tax payers. The city is beholden to a 3% maximum increase. This CID is not beholden to that. This CID can increase its budget significantly just by maintaining the exact same levy rate. The city's levy rate is variable depending on what our budget turns out to be. So they're very different in that respect. My intention in the original resolution was to lower that levy rate slightly to keep the bonding authority on par with what it's been in prior years, still allowing the build out and reimbursement of infrastructure, but reducing that impact on homeowners. So I won't be supporting the motion, but I appreciate the discussion. It was a little bit awkward having just two of us there for the July meeting, and trying to have that back and forth gets very tenuous. So I appreciate having three folks here on the board today to have a little bit more robust discussion. I appreciate David really diving into the numbers and giving us options, showing what the impact will be to homeowners and on the bonding authority, and the thorough work by all. So thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Whittings.
Mr. Chairman, I seconded the motion because in my mind, I felt like the motion I made was the correct one. The in-between one that had less of an impact on the bonding authority did provide some relief, but didn't have as much impact on the unreimbursed interest and the potential to actually get infrastructure built, which, as you rightly pointed out, is the purpose of the district. I will support this motion because on balance, I think this one is closer to the overall mission without having the impact on unreimbursed interest that the original motion would have had. It doesn't mean that I'm not sympathetic to the cost to the homeowners and increased taxes, nor that I don't understand the unique position that this budget holds compared to the budget overall of the city and the limitations on budget increases that the city is restricted to, constrained to. Special districts all over the state do have different rules, and certainly this is one of them. It is an awkward position to be in as a board member, to have a purpose for the district that, while not antithetical, can be sometimes at odds with the overall service that we all sit here for. Having considered all that, I still believe that over the long term, the purpose of the district was to get this infrastructure built and to do it as efficiently from a cost perspective as possible, so that ultimately over time it costs those taxpayers less and or delivers more than would otherwise be the case. And I think by voting yes for this motion today, I'll get closer to meeting that.
Thank you. Before we call a roll, I get the vibe that staff may have something to say to us. Is that right?
So, Mr. Chair, that we would simply recommend that there be a follow-up meeting in which to present the final numbers and put together an L2 after this.
With the seconder's permission, I guess I would amend the motion to include direction for a follow-up meeting for final numbers and analysis.
Yes, I concur.
Clerk, would you call the roll?
Bajent,
Yes.
Clegg,
Yes.
Whittings,
No.
2 in favor, 1 opposed, motion carries.
Thank you. Our final item Board Member Woodings deferred from the beginning of the meeting is the minutes approval. I was not present at the meeting, shouldn't be voting on the minutes, and that prevented a quorum on that vote. So we will take up item 2, looking for a motion with respect to the minutes of July 19th, 2022.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the Harris Ranch Community Infrastructure Number 1 District Number 1 minutes from the regular meeting of July 19th, 2022.
Second,
Clerk, would you call the roll?
Bajent,
I'll abstain.
Clegg,
Yes,
Woodings,
yes.
2 in favor, 1 abstained, motion carries.
With no other business on the agenda, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.